AI governance keeps getting deprioritized for one very simple reason. It gets treated like something secondary, the extra that you deal with after the real work is done, the thing that slows down the roadmap instead of protecting it. And there is one word that's sitting underneath that entire mindset: non functional. That word explains a lot. It explains why leaders say they care about AI governance and still underfund it. It explains why governance gets framed like a tax instead of a requirement. Now, a leader that I worked with showed this to me clearly. He wanted to move fast on AI, and the moment that governance came up, he waved it off as a thing that was going to slow everyone down. To be fair to him, that reaction made sense to me because he had a roadmap and real pressure to ship, and governance showed up like a friction. So I didn't argue the principle with him. I changed the frame. I asked him what it would cost the business if the system made a decision that it could not explain or harmed a group of their customers in a way that ended up in front of a regulator. And that changed the conversation because once we were talking about expected loss instead of slowed timelines, governance stopped looking like a break and started to look like a business protection layer. Hi, my name is Dr. Obi, and I am a researcher and educator in AI governance and behavioral security. I help professionals move into AI governance careers. I also help leaders build governance systems that actually work for them. So in this video, I am going to show you why the label non-functional quietly starves AI governance of budget and attention, and why that framing is misleading. And the business case template that I would put in front of a CFO to defend what governance means. Now, if this is the kind of thinking that you want more of, please subscribe. If you care about AI governance, you care about budgets, you care about risks, or how leaders actually make those decisions, stay with me because this one word explains more than most people realize. Let me define the term first because it comes straight out of software engineering and it is worth getting precise before we apply it to AI governance. In how software gets built, there are two kinds of requirements. Functional requirements is one. It describes what a system does. The login button logs you in, the search bar returns results, and the model classifies the document. You can point at the feature and watch it work. Non-functional requirements, on the other hand, describes how the system has to behave while it does all that it does. Is it fast, secure? Is it reliable? Can you maintain it without the whole thing failing? Now, engineers sometimes call this family of requirements the ilities because so many of them end up sounding that way: the reliability, scalability, maintainability, security, and observability. Now, let me talk about where this gets interesting. And I'm not the first person to notice this. Dave Farley, who co wrote the book Continuous Delivery and is about as senior a voice as you would find in software engineering, he has a YouTube video with a title that I love. It's called Non Functional Requirements Are Stupid. His argument is that the label itself is a problem. Calling these things non-functional quietly teaches teams that they are secondary, the stuff that you get to do after the real work is done, when in truth, they are the critical quality attributes that decide whether the system survives when it comes in contact with the real world. And I found that framing clarifying, and I think it travels directly into AI governance because the thing that we put under governance, whether it's fairness, transparency, accountability, human oversight, these are not separate from what the AI does. They are the conditions on how it is allowed to do what it does. They are the AI version of the ilities. So let's actually place governance inside that family and see if it fits. When a software team says a system has to be secure, nobody treats security as optional. It is a requirement on how the system behaves. When they say it has to be reliable, the same thing. These are not features that a customer clicks on, but customers will feel their absence instantly, and the business pays for that absence in outages, in breaches, and in lost trust. Now, governance sits in that position for AI. So think about what it does. The system should be explainable enough that a stakeholder can understand a decision. Its choices should be traceable so that you can reconstruct what actually happened and why. A person should be able to review or override an important output. It should handle data lawfully and behave reliably under conditions that it will really face in the real world. Now, none of these things are features that you can touch and feel and click on. All of them are conditions on behavior, which means that governance is not a layer that you bolt on after the model works. It is part of what works even means for AI systems that are operating around real people. So I'll go a step further, building on Farley's point. Governance might actually be the clearest example of why non-functional is such a misleading word. And why is that? It's because it is the most cross-cutting attribute of all. Security touches a lot of the system, but governance touches the whole life cycle, touches every team, every decision that the model is trusted to influence. The label non-functional tells you to handle it later on. However, the reality is that it shapes everything from the start. Now, and if you'd stay with me to the end, I am going to put an actual business case template on screen, the kind that you can take to your CFO and that turns all of this from trust me because it matters into a number that a finance leader can actually defend. That template is where this stops being a philosophy and starts being a budget item. Now, to the question that I get most often, which is some version of this. If governance is so important, why is it so hard to actually implement? I want to validate that frustration, first of all, because it is real and it's not a sign that anyone is doing anything wrong. Non-functional requirements are harder than functional ones by their very nature. And governance inherits every bit of that difficulty. And this is why. A functional requirement usually has a clean test. The button either logs you in or it doesn't. But you can't simply count fairness or explainability or governance maturity. You have to first define the metric, the use case, the threshold that you will accept. And when you look around, you find that even reasonable people will argue about all these three things. The requirement is real, but it lives in proxies and judgments rather than a single yes or no. And the thing about it is that all these requirements also create trade-offs. More oversight can slow a deployment. More transparency can expose complexity that you would rather not surface. More control can reduce risk, but on the other hand, it can add process at the same time. So governance often feels vague to an executive and heavy to a delivery team. And both of those feelings are pointing at something that is true. So when governance feels harder to pin down than the rest of a build, that is not a failure of effort. That is a signature of what non-functional requirement is. The difficulty is baked into that category. And naming that honestly is a first step to resourcing it properly instead of quietly hoping that it handles itself. I see governance understood in one of these three ways. Now, it doesn't mean that's the entirety of how governance is understood, but this is how I classify what I am seeing. The first way is that governance is understood as a compliance obligation. This is where most organizations start. And it's understandable because regulatory pressure is growing. The trouble with stopping here is that compliance framing makes governance a gate. And when you do that, the natural thing that comes with creating a gate is that teams quietly figure out a way of working around that gate. And the second way that governance is understood is as a risk control. Now, this is a real step up from just looking at governance as compliance, because now governance is reducing the probability and the impact of something going wrong. And that's the language that leaders already speak. The third way is the one that mature organizations reach, which is governance as an enablement layer. When governance is built in from the start rather than bolted in at the end, teams will stop treating it as an obstacle and start looking at it as the thing that lets them say yes to AI safely. Now, this brings us to the objection that stops most governance investments cold. If governance doesn't produce revenue, then why fund it? Now, and I take that objection seriously because it's honest. Governance usually does not create a clean financial line in the same way that a new future does. But that's the wrong place to look for its value. The value of governance shows up as avoided loss, reduced friction, faster approvals, and brand protection. It lowers the probability and the cost of incidents, the cost of customer backlash, and all the rework that takes place when something isn't done right the first time. It also cuts the hidden drag of doing a manual review and the uncertainty that slows AI programs down. So, the question a leader should be asking is not how does governance make money? The question should be how much value do we preserve and unlock by making AI safe enough to scale? And that question has an answer that you can actually calculate, which is what I want to show you next. So this is a template that I promised at the very beginning, and I want to show you what it looks like when it is presented well, because the format is doing most of the persuasion. The idea underneath this is very simple. For any AI risk, you estimate the expected loss before governance, then the expected loss after governance. And the difference is the value that governance created. Expected loss is just probability times impact, the same math that an insurer or CFO already trusts. So across the top, you have the risk scenario, then the baseline probability, and the baseline impact, which multiply into a baseline expected loss. Then you have the residual probability and the residual impact after your controls are in place, which multiply into a residual expected loss. The gap between these two numbers is your annual risk reduction value. And then a few columns that keep you honest: control effectiveness, implementation cost, annual operating cost. Let me show you what I want you to notice about why this makes a difference in your room. It doesn't pretend that governance is a revenue engine. It translates governance into the language that a finance leader uses for every other control investment, which is downside protection with a defensible number attached to it. So you're not asking them to believe governance matters. What you're actually doing is showing them the expected loss before and after with your assumptions and letting the math carry that argument for you. That's a business case. And it's a thing that turns governance from the first item cut to a line that's worth defending. I'll put a copy of this template in the description so that you can take it to your own conversation. The organizations that win with governance, they'll be the ones who understand it as the thing that lets them move faster without breaking trust. So if you want a structured way to build a foundation in AI governance, I have a free 10-day challenge that walks you through the core of AI governance, and it's linked in the description. And the business case template from this video is also down there too. So you can take the number into your own rooms. Now, and if this whole conversation was useful to you, please tell me in the comments where governance is getting stars in your own world. I will see you in the next video. So across the top, you have the risk scenario, then the baseline probability, and the baseline impact, which multiply into a baseline expected loss. Then you have the residual probability and the residual impact after your controls are in place, which multiply into a residual expected loss. The gap between these two numbers is your annual risk reduction value. And then a few columns that keep you honest: control effectiveness, implementation cost, annual operating cost, and a notes column citing the evidence behind each estimate.